Welcome to this online lesson on the New Model Army. Was the New Model Army Britain's first professional army? If you've already done the lesson on Tudor and Stuart armies, have a go at these do now tasks. How often was the militia inspected by the Lord Lieutenant? In what ways were the trained bands better trained than the militias? And as a challenge, what next steps could be taken to improve the trained bands? Take a moment to answer those questions if you are able. If not, wait a moment and I'll give you some answers. Okay, so the militia was inspected by the Lord Lieutenant once every 2 years, so not very frequently, to keep them equipped and keep them in good order. In what ways are the trained bands better than trained than the militia? Well, they would more frequently train, for one thing, so they would train once a month during the summer months, and they were under the command of a muster master who was more of a professional, who could give them better training and advice. Not that it was always taken, of course. What could be done to improve the trained bands? Well, one of the big things was discipline and the way that men were recruited into the army. If you could get men to volunteer for the army rather than having to press them to fight, they would be more committed to the cause. Also, if you could train them more regularly and more professionally with actual pay, that would also improve their professionalism and their commitment in battle. And it's those things that the New Model Army attempted to do. Let's have a look at some background about who the New Model Army were. The New Model Army. After the victory at Marston Moor in 1644, Parliament decided to restructure its armies so that they might be even more effective. This army was to be a completely new model, hence the name, the New Model Army. Don't think of them as toy soldiers. Think about it in the sense that you get a new model of car. It's still a car, it's just an improved version. So is the New Model Army. What Parliament were trying to do here was build on their experience from fighting in the rest of the English Civil War. They'd seen how inadequate their armies had been early in that war and were determined to do something about it. The New Model Army was going to be led by two proven commanders, Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, although Oliver Cromwell almost voted himself out of a job when MPs were forbidden from serving in the army. Luckily, that law was put right just in time for him to be able to make a difference. What might be their priorities in order to improve Parliament's army? Well, perhaps one thing would be training. Linked to that might be discipline. Perhaps giving them a sense of identity as well. Remember that religion was also an important factor in these times. Remember that they needed to be equipped, preferably with the best weapons available. And most of all, perhaps, the belief in their cause. Well, let's see how Parliament tried to set about this. Here's a list of battles that Parliament fought after Marston Moor in 1644. These are all battles that Parliament won. Bampton in the Bush, 1645, Naseby, 1645, Langport, 1645, Bristol, 1645, Exeter, 1646, Bovey Tracy, 1646, Great Torrington, 1646, Stow on the Wold, 1646, Wallingford Castle, 1646. Okay, yeah, there's loads of them. Now we're going to have a look at the list of royalist victories in the same period. Deep breath now. Farringdon in 1645, which is quite a small battle all told between a group of cavalry. No, looks like that's about it. Oh, clearly Parliament had got their priorities right, because they were winning battles and ultimately they would win the English Civil War. So let's see how they did it. These are the priorities of the English Civil War New Model Army under the command of Parliament. The New Model Army would be properly and regularly paid. That might not seem revolutionary, but at this time that was actually quite unusual. Well clothed with a red uniform. Although individual regiments might have a coloured jacket, the idea of a uniform that an entire army would have was brand new. The reason they chose red we'll come back to. Rewarded with money and promotions for good conduct. Punished for mistakes or bad behaviour, a good way of keeping discipline. And preferably Puritan, a strict type of Protestant Christian. Okay, that might not be a priority for modern armies, but at the time when it was believed that they needed to get God on their side, the commanders felt that this was a priority. Your tasks then. Which priority was most important in improving the effectiveness of the army? Whatever you choose, you give an explanation of your choice. Then what elements would Parliament not realistically achieve? Give that some thought, pause the video now, and press play when you're ready to continue. Well, whichever one you chose for your top priority, consider how it would actually affect the fighting effectiveness of the army. As for the challenge of which could not be realistically achieved, There are several. Firstly, equipping every soldier with an identical red uniform was probably beyond the question, but getting everyone to wear some form of red was more realistic. Also, making sure the men could be regularly paid was also quite unrealistic for the time, but it was a noble aim and something that Parliament certainly tried to do. However, probably the one that was least practical was the Puritan one. There simply weren't enough Puritans of fighting age in the country in order to equip the entire army, and to rely purely on volunteers was always beyond Parliament's means. However, it was a start. A couple of other points as well. Why the red uniform? Well, often it's said because the red would then blend in with the blood and prevent the men from panicking in battle. This is rubbish. Not true at all. The red uniform was chosen simply because it was the cheapest dye available. Luckily, as also red was seen as quite a powerful, strong and even lucky colour as well, so men would have been quite pleased to wear it. As for being punished for mistakes for bad behaviour, well, there were lots of different punishments set down in the ordinances of the New Model Army, but one of my favourites is running the gauntlet. If a man, for example, had mistreated his uniform or mistreated his equipment, or perhaps endangered another man, then he would be forced to run the gauntlet. Here, a section of pikemen would take their heavy leather gloves and fill them with gravel. A man would have to strip to the waist and walk down his entire regiment with everyone thwacking him as hard as they could on his back with their gauntlets filled with gravel. And if you didn't hit your mate hard enough, you would be the next to run the gauntlet. So if you've ever heard that term being used, to run the gauntlet, this is where it comes from. We're now going to build our knowledge on priorities of the New Model Army. So if you haven't made a note down of these already, then please do so before moving on. Once you're ready, we'll continue. Okay, let's go on to the main task. You need to create a mind map like this. A large piece of A4 paper or a double-page spread in a book is perfect for this. In the middle, you need to put what was the New Model Army like, and then the following sections: their strength, money, training, weapons, and as an extra extension, you could consider any problems that the New Model Army still faced. Now remember, we're trying to explain whether the New Model Army really was a professional army. So we need to consider, were they being paid to do something as a job and a career? Was it a job done by people who were receiving this pay? And was it a case of them showing great skill and being expert at their jobs? Pause the video now and take down the mind map. Done? Okay, remember you can also colour code these and illustrate them to make them even more memorable. We're going to look at the first section now. Strength. The New Model Army was led by proven commanders, so Thomas Fairfax, who was the overall commander, and Oliver Cromwell, who was the commander of cavalry. In it, there were 22,000 men in total, quite a large army for the period. Of these, there were 6,600 cavalry, 14,400 foot soldiers, these were divided between musketeers and pikemen, and 1,000 were dragoons. Remember that dragoons fought on foot with muskets, much in the same way as musketeers, but they arrived on horseback, making them ideal for use as scouts and skirmishers. The cavalry were mostly volunteers, committed to the parliamentarian fight, but most of the infantry remained pressed men who were being forced to fight, although this was a positive step in the right direction. The officers, the men in charge, were no longer given their jobs based upon how rich or posh they were. For example, an early commander of Parliament's armies was the Earl of Essex, who might have expected to have such a role. Instead, now Parliament's commanders had to prove that they were good at their jobs. This is called a meritocracy. Merit meaning that you've done something well, and cracy meaning governed by. So this means that they are being led by men who have proved that they know how to do a good job. Make any notes that you want around your mind map now based upon strength, and remember that some of these factors might even go into some of the other sections as well. Pause the video now. Okay, have a look at your mind map. You should have at the very least 3 detailed examples for that section on strength now. If you haven't, add them before moving on. If you have, let's go. Now, money. One immediate priority was to ensure that the men in the army were loyal and satisfied with their treatment. This would result in good morale, which means the happiness of the soldiers. The New Model Army was properly and regularly paid. 8 pence a day for foot soldiers, which was not great, but the average wage for a labourer, and at least reliable, and 2 shillings or 24 pence a day for the cavalry. This was good pay, but cavalry had to provide their own food and horses. This might not seem much, but food and clothing was provided for the infantry as well as the money. They were issued with red jackets as a uniform. One of the crucial things about the 8p a day figure is that a labourer would be expected to receive about that much pay for working on a farm. Now, much as farm work was nothing like as dangerous as the New Model Army, it was still back-breaking work, and these men might have been motivated by a bit of a sense of adventure as well. Also, bearing in mind that although they would be regularly training, often the life of a soldier would not be necessarily as hard as the life of an agricultural labourer at certain times of the year. But of course, there would be times it would be very, very difficult indeed. For example, when people are shooting at you. Anyway, make some detailed notes on the money section now, and remember you can also add some detail to other sections if you think it would be helpful. Pause the video now. Okay, again, make sure that you've got 3 detailed examples in that section, and then we'll move on. This is probably the shortest section, but weapons are important and need to be considered. Just like all armies during the Civil War, the main weapons remain pikes. These are the 5-metre long spears that were used to defend against cavalry. Matchlock muskets, slow-firing, inaccurate guns, but very powerful when they hit their targets. And cavalry armed with swords and pistols. There was also armour like that pictured. That's a very high-status cavalry armour of the Civil War period. Parliament's good reserves of money meant that plenty was spent on making these weapons the best quality available. Ammunition, lead and gunpowder, was plentiful for musketeers and artillery. Armour was improved, especially for the cavalry, who became known as Ironsides because of the strength of their armour, equipment and determination in battle. Again, see if you can add 3 detailed examples to your mind map. Pause the video now. Ready to move on? Right, let's have a look at the last section. Training and discipline. Satisfied, well-fed and well-paid soldiers tend to be more disciplined. That means they're more likely to follow orders because they don't need to free quarter, to steal and loot to get money and food. They feel like they're well treated. They feel loyal to their cause. The New Model Army was better trained too, so it felt more confident of their own and their commanders' abilities in battle. This was crucial, especially for men who had never fought a battle before. Discipline was also shown on the battlefield. Cromwell trained the cavalry personally. He didn't let his cavalry chase enemies off the field. They stayed put, charging repeatedly until the battle was won, much like a wrecking ball demolishing a building. Now, consider earlier battles of the war. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, one of the key commanders of the Royalist army, had shown his skill in battle many times, but he'd also shown his lack of discipline. For example, at Edge Hill he had fled the battlefield, not because he was scared, but because he wanted to plunder the town of Kyneton and reward his men. This was not the way to win a battle, and Parliament made sure that their men had their eye on the task at hand. Make some detailed notes around your mind map on training and discipline. Again, you should be aiming for at least 3 detailed real examples. Pause the video now. Done? Let's review. Remember, you should have sections on all of these different topics. What about as a challenge? Have we considered some problems that the New Model Army still faced? Let's go through some now. Well, firstly, the pay. Although Parliament always had more money than the King, controlling important areas like London, it was still going to be a challenge to reliably pay these men. Physically carting the cash around and handing it out reliably was going to be an immense challenge. Also, relying on training and discipline. It's all very well giving your men effective training, but if they've never fought a battle before, veteran soldiers are still likely to be more effective than them. Although King Charles's army was getting smaller, it tended to be the more experienced of the 2 armies. This was going to be a major challenge. Lastly, the reliance on pressing men for the infantry. This is something that Parliament tried not to do, but try as they might, they were never going to be able to raise their 22,000 men through any other way but pressing them. And in fact, the New Model Army rarely got above 16,000 men in strength. So there were problems still to overcome. We're going to move on to the last section now. Let's see if you can put your knowledge to the test. This is a little game called If This Is the Answer, What Is the Question? 1. 2 shillings. 2. 22,000. 3. 14,400. 4. Pressed. 5. Ironsides. 6. Cromwell. 7. Free quarter. and 8, 8 pence. Come up with some questions to go with these answers now. Pause the video, and when you're done, we'll consider what questions might have gone with them. Finished? Well, let's have a look. 2 shillings was the amount paid to the cavalry, so your question might have been, how much were parliamentarian cavalry paid? 22,000 was the total aimed for size of the new model army. So you could have had the question, how large was the new model army planned to be? 14,400 was the number of infantry, so your question might have been, how many pikemen and musketeers were in the parliamentarian new model army? Pressed is a term for forcing men to fight, so your question could have been, most of parliamentarian infantry were recruited by what method? The Ironsides were a nickname for the cavalry, so your question could have been, what nickname was given to the parliamentarian cavalry? Oliver Cromwell was in charge of the cavalry, so your question might have been, who was in command of the cavalry? Free quarter is where you take food and lodgings without paying for them whilst on the march. So your question might have been, how did armies in the Civil War usually supply themselves? And lastly, 8 pence was the average wage of a labourer and indeed of a new model army soldier. So your question might have been, how much were the infantry paid in the new model army? If you're able to do that, then you've probably built your knowledge quite well. But were they really a professional army? Well, this is where we need to move on. Let's finish up by having a look at applying this knowledge to the exam. Here's a typical 12-mark question. Explain how the new model army, 1640s, can be considered professional compared to militias. Now, if you've not already done the work on Tudor and Stuart militias, then I'd suggest you do that first. If you have, let's proceed. Now, in the Edexcel exam, you will also be given some stimulus material to help you with a question of this length. You may use the following in your answer: the Lord Lieutenant and regular pay. Notice that it says you may use the following in your answer. You don't have to. So if these 2 pieces of stimulus came up, you would not have to use them in order to get the marks. However, you must also use information of your own. That's the really crucial bit here. If you don't use any information of your own, you can't get full marks. There are 12 marks in this question, 6 of which will be for your knowledge and 6 of which will be for your analysis and explanation. You should expect to spend between 18 and 20 minutes on a question of this length, which should be pretty reasonable. Here's how to answer it. Ideally, you should explain 3 examples that made the new model army professional. Remember Peel, I'll come back to that. So it would make sense to explain something that relates to the Lord Lieutenant, explain something that relates to regular pay, and then choose another example of your own before concluded. Make a point, say why the new model army was more professional than the militia. Then make an example, give an example of its professionalism, and explain how that made them professional. Then link it back to the question, explain why that was more professional than the militia system. Point, example, explain, link, or Peel for short. But don't forget, at the end of your answer, give a brief conclusion. Explain the most important factor or what overall theme links these factors together. So, that's a 12-mark question, 18 to 20 minutes to do it. You may begin and pause the video now. Done? Alright, let's have a look at an example answer. This will give you the opportunity to improve your answer should you need to. Explain how the new model army, 1640s, can be considered professional compared to militias. Notice that I have colour-coded my answer here. My point is in red, examples are in blue, further explanation in green, and the link back to the question, comparing the militia and their professionalism to the new model army, is in purple. One way the new model army was more professional than the militia system was in its training. For example, Oliver Cromwell took personal command of the training of the parliamentarian cavalry. Their subsequent discipline and determination earned them the nickname Ironsides. This was more professional than the militia system, whose Lord Lieutenant would only inspect them once every 2 years, so training was minimal. Notice here I've included the first example from the stimulus material, the Lord Lieutenant. Let's have a look at the next. Another reason relates to pay. New model army infantry were paid 8 pence a day and cavalry 2 shillings. It was unusual for armies to be paid at this time, let alone to be paid in such a standardised and organised way. This was more professional than the militia, who were not paid at all, but were rather expected to pay for their own weapons and equipment. Okay, so that's included the stimulus material point about regular pay. Let's see what own knowledge I've included. Well, I've included some own knowledge throughout my answer so far, but this is going to be the example that's purely my own. Finally, the new model army had more volunteers. Although Parliament still needed to press men into the infantry, the emphasis on getting men to volunteer to join the army was important. It was recognised that volunteers would show greater commitment to fighting for their cause than men who had no choice but to join the army. This was more professional than the militia, who would be pressed for service abroad and would therefore regularly desert from the army. Alright, so my own point there is about volunteers. Now to conclude. Now you could look at this from a thematic point of view and look at what overall theme links this. Perhaps you'd consider it to be pay or training. I've decided to go for the most important factor. Overall, the most important factor was the new model army's training. Unlike the militia, the training was a professional requirement of volunteers who were being paid for their services. This meant that even inexperienced new model army soldiers would be more disciplined and professional than soldiers in a militia. This made the new model army more professional than the militia because Parliament was aiming for soldiers to treat being in the army as a job rather than something that they were forced or required to do. And that's the end of my answer. Compare it to your own, make any additions and adjustments and improvements that you consider necessary, and let's see how close you get up to 12 marks. Remember that you should give 6 marks for your knowledge. Did you include the stimulus points? Did you include examples from your own knowledge? If you did and it's accurate, award yourself the full 6 marks. What about your explanation? Check your linking sentences. Are you always referring back to the professionalism of the new model army compared to the militia? I've done this in purple in particular on my answer. If you have, and you've included a conclusion that ties it all together, then you can also give yourself 6 marks. Although this looks like a lot of writing on the screen, it's probably less than an A4 page if handwritten. So once you've checked that over, give yourself your total mark. Hopefully it went pretty well. And that's the end of the lesson. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much, and goodbye.